The dust never really settled in Caldwell Creek. It rose with the morning, hung fat and orange in the throat of the valley all day long, and lay itself down only when the sun pulled the last of its heat below the ridge. Even then it didn't disappear. It just waited, patient as sin, for something to disturb it again. A boot heel, a wagon wheel, a body falling. Lina Marsh had learned to live inside that dust the way other women learn to live inside their grief. Quietly, without complaint, with the private knowledge that it was slowly filling her lungs. She was 23 years old when Harlan Bode told her he had saved her life. She was 23 years old, and she had not asked him to. It was the summer of 1882, the kind of summer that cracked the earth like old porcelain and made the horses mean. Lina had come to Caldwell Creek 2 years prior, following her husband Jesse on the back of a borrowed mule, carrying nothing but a flour sack of clothes and the particular brand of hope that belongs only to people who have never had enough reason to stop hoping. Jesse had come for the land. There was talk of a homestead grant, 40 acres east of the creek that ran brown and slow through the valley floor. He had shaken hands on it with a man in Tucson whose name Lina could not now remember, and they had ridden 3 days into the desert on the faith of that handshake. Jesse was 26 when they arrived. He was 27 when he died. The fever took him in October of that first year, quick and merciless, the way fevers always seemed to take the young men in that country. Lina sat with him 4 days and 4 nights, pressing wet cloths to his forehead, listening to his breathing change from rough to shallow to something that no longer sounded like breathing at all. On the 5th morning she walked out of the cabin and stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the 40 acres, at the brown creek, at the ridge line that cut the pale sky like a knife. She was 21 years old. She did not cry. She went back inside and she wrapped Jesse in his good blanket and she buried him herself, under the cottonwood at the east end of the property, because there was no one else to do it. She stayed. People in town asked her why. The Widow Marsh, they called her, though it sounded strange on a woman so young, like a coat cut for someone else's shoulders. She stayed because the land was hers now, or near enough as made no difference, and because she had nowhere else to go that was not worse than this. She planted in the spring. She kept 2 goats and a flock of chickens that were mostly ornery and half-wild. She sold eggs in town on Saturdays and traded goat milk for flour and salt when she could. She was not prospering, but she was surviving, and in Caldwell Creek in 1882, survival was its own kind of dignity. Harlan Bode owned the feed and grain on the main street, a wide-shouldered building with a false front that made it look more important than it was. He was 61 years old, a widower himself, barrel-chested and slow, moving with a white beard that he kept neat and a pair of pale gray eyes that people in town described as kind. He had been in Caldwell Creek longer than most, had watched it grow from 3 buildings and a well to something that almost resembled a town. He knew everyone and everyone knew him, and when people spoke of him they used words like solid and decent and good, the same words they used for the landscape, as if both the man and the valley had simply endured long enough to deserve the description. Harlan had noticed Lina from the beginning. She came into the feed store every few weeks, buying in small quantities because that was all she could afford, always paying exact. Coins counted out carefully in her palm before she set them on the counter. She was not a beautiful woman in the way the word was commonly used in those parts, meaning she was not pink-cheeked and soft, not the kind of woman men wrote home about. She was lean and brown from the sun, with dark eyes that moved quickly over everything and hands that showed work. But there was something in the way she carried herself, straight-backed and deliberate, that Harlan found himself watching longer than he should have. He told himself it was concern. She was young and alone, and the land out there was hard on people who had help, let alone people who didn't. He told himself it was concern, and he half believed it, which was the most dangerous kind of lie. The summer of 1882 was when the trouble started with the Garfield brothers. There were 3 of them, Court, Denny, and the youngest, Webb, who was 19 and had the particular cruelty that lives in boys who have learned nothing from men worth learning from. They ran cattle on the North Range, and they had been pushing their fence line south for 2 seasons, inch by inch the way men do when they are testing what they can take without being stopped. By July their wire had crossed the creek and was cutting into the eastern edge of the 40 acres that belonged, in every practical sense, to Lina Marsh. She had spoken to them once. gone out to where Court was stretching wire in the August heat and told him plainly that the creek was the boundary and he knew it. Court was 40 and lean-faced, with a mouth that barely moved when he talked. He had looked at her for a long moment, then looked past her at the cabin, then looked back at her with the expression men wear when they have decided a thing but have not yet decided to say it aloud. "Widow woman can't work 40 acres alone," he said. "That land's half going to waste anyhow." "It's my land," Lina said. "Might be," Court said. "Might not be, time's done with it." She rode into town the next day and spoke to the land office. A small hot room above the bank where a man named Otis Pruitt kept records and ledgers so old the ink had faded to gray. Pruitt was helpful in the way of men who are helpful only when helpfulness costs them nothing. He confirmed that the 40 acres east of Caldwell Creek were filed under the name Jessie Marsh, deceased, and that the claim could legally pass to a surviving spouse. He did not tell her anything she didn't already know. He also did not tell her what she needed to know, which was whether anyone had filed a competing claim on the same parcel. She found that out a week later, when Webb Garfield rode past her cabin at a trot and threw a folded paper into her yard without stopping. She unfolded it standing in the dust, reading it twice to be sure she understood it. It was a notice of contested ownership, filed by Court Garfield, asserting that the original claim had lapsed due to abandonment following the death of the primary claimant. Lina stood in the yard for a long time, the paper in her hand, the sun pressing down on the back of her neck. She had not abandoned the land. She had been standing on it every day for 2 years. But the law out here was a loose and flexible instrument, shaped by whoever had the money to hire someone to hold it. She went to Harlan Bode that evening, because there was nowhere else to go. She did not go to him as a woman goes to a man she trusts. She went to him as a person goes to the only resource available, which is a different thing entirely, and she knew it. He was the oldest established businessman in town. He sat on the informal council that settled disputes before they went to the county seat. He knew Judge Alcott, who came through every 2 months and held court in the back room of the saloon. If anyone in Caldwell Creek could speak on her behalf, it was Harlan Bode. He was sitting on the porch of his house when she rode up, behind the feed store in a yard that was well kept and a little too neat for a man living alone. He stood when he saw her, which she noted. Men in that country didn't always. She told him the situation plainly. No tears, no dramatics, just the facts in the order they had happened. The fence line moving, the confrontation with Court, the notice from the land office, what Pruitt had said. Harlan listened with his hands on his knees, his gray eyes on her face, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding how much of what they're thinking to say. "Garfields have been pushing at that creek line for a while," he said. "Court's been patient about it. Patient men are the most dangerous kind." "I know it," Lina said. "You need someone to speak at the hearing. Judge Alcott comes through end of August. 6 weeks. "I know that too." "I'll speak for you," Harlan said. "I know Alcott. He'll listen to me." He paused. "I'll do it, Lina. You don't need to worry about this." She thanked him. She rode home. She did not sleep well, not because she didn't believe he would do what he said, but because she had been in the world long enough to know that nothing comes free, and she couldn't yet see what this would cost her. The 6 weeks between that evening and the hearing were the weeks when Harlan Bode began to make himself indispensable. Started small, the way everything starts. He sent a man out to repair the fence along the creek, the honest boundary, so that when the hearing came there would be a clear physical marker. She hadn't asked him to, and when she rode over and saw the new posts and the clean wire she felt something she couldn't entirely name. Gratitude folded around a thin wire of unease. He said nothing about it the next time she came into town. He simply told her that Judge Alcott had received his letter and that the hearing would proceed as scheduled. He said it like a man reporting the weather, easy and certain, as if there had never been any doubt. Then he began coming out to the property. The first time he had a reason. He brought the formal notice of the hearing date, which could have been sent with anyone or simply kept at the store for her to collect. But he rode out himself on a Saturday morning when she was working the garden, and he sat on his horse for a while watching her work and then dismounted and helped her for an hour without being asked, pulling weeds with his big hands and talking about nothing particular. The price of feed, the drought, a family that had come through last week heading north. She did not tell him to stop. That was the thing she turned over later, in the dark of the cabin, the thing she examined from every angle. She did not tell him to stop because he had not done anything wrong. He was an old man being neighborly. He was going to speak for her at a hearing that might save her land. What kind of woman tells a man like that to go away? So she let him stay. He came back 2 weeks later with a load of timber in his wagon. Cedar posts for the south side fence that had been rotting at the base since she'd arrived. She told him she couldn't pay for the timber right now. He waved his hand, said it was nothing, said he'd had it sitting at the store for a season. She accepted it because the fence needed doing and she could not afford to be proud. He stayed most of the day, working the posts in with a confidence that showed he'd done this kind of work before, once long ago when he was different. She made coffee in the cabin and brought it out to him, and they sat in the shade of the cottonwood near Jesse's grave and drank it, and Harlan looked at the grave marker. A simple board with the name and the year, and said something quiet and respectful, and Lina found herself talking about Jesse in a way she hadn't talked about him to anyone. The shape of his hands, the way he laughed, the particular stubbornness that had brought them out here in the first place, and whether she'd hated him for it at first, and whether she hated him for it now. She didn't, she said. You can't hate someone for believing in a thing. Harlan nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. After that, he came every week. She noticed how the town noticed. Women at the dry goods, pausing in their conversation when she walked in. The nod of the man behind the counter at the bank. Warmer than it had been before, she thought, though she might have imagined it. She had the uncomfortable sense that something was being understood about her situation that she had not consented to. A story being written by people who weren't in it, with herself as a character she didn't recognize. She tried to put it out of her mind. The hearing was coming. The land was what mattered. The hearing was held on a Wednesday, in the back room of the Iron Mare Saloon, with Judge Alcott presiding from behind a table that was usually used for poker. Court Garfield was there with a lawyer he'd brought up from Tucson. A thin, pale man named Riddle who spoke with the efficiency of someone billing by the hour. Lina had no lawyer. She had Harlan Bode, who sat beside her in a clean shirt and spoke when his turn came in a slow and measured voice that carried the weight of 30 years in the same town. The weight of someone who had never been doubted by anyone sitting in that room. He said that Lina Marsh had worked her land without interruption since the death of her husband. He said he had personal knowledge of this, as a neighbor and a man of business. He said that the claim of abandonment was without foundation, and that the Garfield fence line had been pushed deliberately and with foreknowledge across a boundary that had been surveyed and recorded. He said all of it quietly and without flourish, and when he was done he sat down and put his hands on the table and looked at the judge with his pale gray eyes. Judge Alcott ruled for Lina Marsh. The Garfield lawyer filed a note of objection that meant nothing. Court left the room without looking at her. Webb spat in the dirt outside, which she saw through the window, and she held still and did not let her face do anything. She was shaking by the time she got outside, though she would not have called it fear. It was the body's account of everything it had held closed for 6 weeks, settling in the bones. Harlan found her by the hitch rail and put his hand on her shoulder, a brief and fatherly pressure, and said, "It's done. It's yours." She told him she was grateful. She meant it. She thanked him in full and without reservation, and she rode home feeling something she had almost forgotten, the sensation of the ground being solid beneath her, of a thing being settled and hers. She should have understood then that Harlan didn't see it as settled. That for him it was just beginning. The change was gradual enough that she couldn't name the moment it shifted, which was, she understood later, exactly the point. He continued coming to the property. He continued bringing things. Small things now, a jar of honey, a new hoe handle to replace the one she'd cracked, a length of rope. He never made much of them. He set them down and went on talking about other things, and she received them because they were useful and because the alternative was to make something of them herself, to say the words that would change what this was, and she was not sure she had the right to say those words to a man who had saved her land. That was how it worked. Not through force or threat, but through accumulation. Through debt she had never agreed to carry, laid on her one small gift at a time until the weight of it was impossible to ignore. By October he had started talking about the future. Not his future or her future separately. the future as a shared thing, spoken of in the slow and careful way of a man who has thought about it for a long time and is now simply reporting the conclusions of that thinking. He talked about the cabin, how it could be expanded. He talked about the south pasture, how it would carry cattle if it was properly watered, and he had some money set aside, enough to dig a proper well. He talked about all of this in the same even voice he used for everything, as if it were reasonable and settled, as if the only remaining step were her agreement. She let the talk go by the first few times. She did not say yes and she did not say no. She understood that she was supposed to hear in this talk a question, and that when the question was finally spoken plainly she would be expected to give an answer shaped by gratitude. She had been afraid of many things in her life, the fever taking Jessie, the Garfields and their wire, the slow quiet terror of being alone in a hard country. But the fear that moved through her on those October afternoons was different. It was the fear of a woman who understands that the transaction has already been conducted, that the goods were delivered over the summer in timber and testimony, and that the bill is now being presented. She started to avoid him, stopped going into town on Saturdays, sent her eggs with a neighbor girl who passed on the road, paying her a few coins for the trouble. When she needed flour, she rode to Hennessy's general store on the far end of the street, where Harlan had no reason to be. She was not ready to say the words she needed to say. She was still hoping that if she made herself quiet enough, small enough, distant enough, he would understand without her having to speak. He came out in November, on a cold morning when the ground was hard. She was splitting wood in the yard and she saw him from a distance, the dark shape of him on the road, and she set down the axe and straightened her back and waited. He dismounted and stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, and he said it plainly then. He asked her to marry him. He said it in the voice of a man who expected yes. Not arrogantly, not cruelly. The expectation was built into the structure of the question itself, into the months that had preceded it, into the architecture of what he had done for her. He said he was fond of her, that he admired her, that she was too good a woman to be out here alone. He said he was getting old and he would like to have something to look after again. He said she would want for nothing. He said the land would be secure. Lina listened to all of it. Then she said no. She said it quietly and she said it once because that was all she had. She said she was grateful for everything he had done, for the hearing and the fence posts and all of it, and she was sorry if she had let him believe something that was not true. She said she meant to stay on her land alone and that was her right and she hoped he understood. Harlan's face didn't change much. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward. His face barely changed. He looked at her for a long moment with his pale gray eyes, and she could see him deciding something, the way she'd seen men decide things before, and then he put his hat back on. "You'll reconsider," he said. Not angry, just certain. "I won't," she said. He rode away. She stood in the yard until he was out of sight, then picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, though her hands were not steady. She split a cord of wood that afternoon, more than she needed, because the axe was something solid to hold. The week after that, Pruitt at the land office sent her a letter. The letter informed her that a review had been initiated of the original claim filing, following a formal request submitted by one Court Garfield, who had retained legal counsel in Tucson. The review would examine whether the original claimant, Jessie Marsh, had fulfilled all conditions of the homestead grant prior to his death, and whether the transfer to the surviving spouse was legally complete. Lina was requested to appear and present documentation. She read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light coming in through the small window. Court Garfield had lost his hearing in August. He had filed this review request in October, 2 weeks after she had refused Harlan Bode. She did not believe in coincidences, not the kind that arrived in envelopes. She thought about going back to Harlan. She thought about it the way you think about a door you know leads somewhere bad. You stand in front of it and you understand what's behind it, and then you think about whether there is any other door, any at all, and you take stock of every wall in the room. There was the Tucson lawyer, but she had no money for a Tucson lawyer. There was Judge Alcott, but Alcott came through every 2 months and the review was scheduled before his next circuit. There was the county seat, but the county seat was 4 days' ride and she had no one to leave the property with. She went to Harlan. She went to the feed store on a gray morning and she walked in and she stood at the counter until he came out from the back. And she told him what the letter said. She watched his face while she told him. He listened with the same patient attention he always gave things, and when she was done he nodded slowly. "Court's not giving up," he said. "No," she said. "It seems he's not." A silence. The smell of grain and leather and the drywood smell of the false-fronted building. "I told you you'd reconsider," Harlan said. She heard it land. She let it land without moving, without showing him what it did. "I'm asking for your help," she said. "The same as before." "Before, you didn't have anything I needed," he said. He said it simply, without cruelty, without pleasure, the way a man states a business condition. "Things have changed." She walked out of the store. She stood on the main street of Caldwell Creek in the gray November morning and she looked at the length of it. The buildings, the people moving, the dust that even in November was there, sitting in the air, waiting. She was 23 years old. She had 40 acres and 2 goats and a flock of half-wild chickens and a dead husband under a cottonwood tree and a piece of paper in her pocket that was going to take all of it away from her unless she gave herself to a man she did not want in exchange for the effort of someone to stop it. She walked to the other end of the street, to Hennessy's General Store, and she asked Pete Hennessy if she could sit at his table in the back. He was a lean and decent man with no investment in anyone else's affairs, which was the best thing she could say about him. He brought her coffee without being asked and went back to his work and left her alone. She sat there for 2 hours. By the time she left she had decided 3 things. She was not going to marry Harlan Bode. She was not going to fight Court Garfield with a lawyer she didn't have. And she was not going to be moved off her land by either of them. What she was going to do required a different kind of patience than she'd practiced so far. It required the patience of someone who understands that the game being played has more moves in it than have yet been played, and that waiting for the right moment is not the same as losing. She wrote a letter that afternoon, at her kitchen table, by the light of the lamp. She addressed it to a woman named Ruth Alcott, in the county seat. Ruth Alcott was the judge's wife, and she was also, Lina had heard from a woman at the dry goods, the secretary of a Citizens Land Registry Association that had been formed 2 years prior specifically to document homestead claims and provide legal support to homesteaders in dispute. Lina had heard this once, in passing, in a conversation she had not been part of. She had filed it away because she was the kind of person who filed things away. She wrote the letter carefully, setting out the facts in the order they had happened. The fence line, the first hearing, the second review, the dates. She did not write anything about Harlan Bode. She did not need to. The dates were eloquent on their own. She posted the letter the following Saturday, riding to town early and posting it at the mail office before Harlan's store was open, and riding back before the street was fully awake. Then she waited. December came, and the ground froze, and she kept the animals and kept herself and let the days go by. Harlan did not come to the property. She did not go to his store. The town moved around her in the way towns do. People watching without appearing to watch, conversation stopping when she walked in, starting again after she left. She understood that the story being told about her now was not the same as the story told in the summer. The summer story had been about a young widow surviving, which was a story people liked because it cost them nothing. The winter story was about a young widow who had turned down the most eligible man in town and couldn't hold her own land, which was a story that let people feel justified in whatever happened next. She did not let it reach her, or she reached for that, at least. Some days she managed it better than others. The letter from Ruth Alcott arrived in the 3rd week of December. It was brief and direct, and it was the best thing Lina had read since the ruling in August. Ruth Alcott wrote that she had reviewed the details Lina had provided, and that the association had a lawyer who handled exactly these situations. She wrote that the review initiated by Court Garfield appeared to be procedurally irregular, having been filed after the matter was already settled by judicial ruling, and that this irregularity might itself be grounds to have the review dismissed. She wrote that the lawyer's name was Emmett Cross and that he would be in Caldwell Creek in January, on the occasion of Judge Alcott's next circuit, and that he would meet with Lina at no charge to her. Lina read it 3 times. She folded it and put it in the flour tin under the flour, where she kept the things that mattered. January came slow and gray, and Emmett Cross came with it, a compact man in his 40s with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who spoke in the precise and economical way of someone who has learned to be careful with words because words are the only tools he carries. He met Lina at Hennessy's back table, because she had decided not to meet him anywhere that Harlan Bode could see or report, and he spread the papers on the table and went through them in order. He agreed with Ruth Alcott's assessment. The review filing was procedurally improper. A previous judicial ruling on the same matter could not be reopened without new evidence of substance, and Court Garfield had presented no new evidence. The original claim was clean. Jesse Marsh had fulfilled the required residency before his death, and the transfer to Lina was properly recorded. Then why is this happening? Lina asked. Cross took his spectacles off and cleaned them on his shirt and put them back on. Because Garfield has a lawyer who's willing to file things that won't ultimately hold, knowing that most women in your position don't have the resources or the knowledge to respond. They're betting on attrition. He paused. Someone may have encouraged them to try again. He said it carefully, looking at the table rather than at her. She heard what he was not saying. What do I need to do? She asked. Come to the hearing Tuesday. I'll be there. Judge Alcott will dismiss the review. After that, I'd recommend filing a formal affidavit of continuous occupancy, dated and witnessed, so there's a permanent record that cannot be challenged. She came to the hearing on Tuesday. It was smaller than the August hearing, more formal, held in the same back room with the poker table but with fewer people present. Emmett Cross spoke quietly and at length, citing statute numbers and procedural rules in a language that sounded like law but that Lina was following, because she had been reading those same statutes by lamplight for the past 3 weeks, borrowing Pruitt's copies of the Territorial Code on the pretext of checking her own records. Judge Alcott dismissed the review in under 20 minutes. Court Garfield's Tucson lawyer filed a note. Again, that meant nothing. Again. Court left the room. Again, without looking at her. This time Webb didn't spit in the dirt. This time they just left, the way men leave when they've decided the fight isn't worth the cost. She didn't trust it entirely, that departure, but she believed in it enough for today. Harlan Bode was in the room. He was sitting near the back, not a party to the hearing, just present. She had seen him when she came in and had not acknowledged him, and he had not acknowledged her. She did not look at him during the hearing. After the ruling, she walked out with Emmett Cross and they stood on the street for a few minutes while he explained the affidavit process, and she listened and asked the right questions, and when he left she stood alone on the street for a moment. Harlan came out of the building behind her. She heard his boots on the boards and turned around. He was looking at her with his pale gray eyes, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger, exactly, and not hurt, though there was some of that. It was the expression of a man who is looking at something that has not behaved in the way things are supposed to behave, and does not know what to do with that yet. You found yourself another way, he said. I did, she said. Emmett Cross, Ruth Alcott's boy. He said it like he was naming the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known was being assembled. You wrote to her. I did. Smart, he said. He said it without pleasure. You're a smart woman, Lina. I've had to be, she said. A long pause, the January wind moving along the street, lifting a little dust even in winter. I saved your life, he said. Last summer. Without me speaking at that hearing, Alcott might have gone the other way. She looked at him steadily. She let the words sit between them in the cold air. You did speak at that hearing, she said. And I thanked you for it. I meant that thanks. But a thing done in kindness doesn't become a debt unless the person giving decides it is. She paused. You decided it was. Something moved across his face. Not remorse, she wouldn't call it that. Something older and more complicated. Something that lives in men who are fundamentally decent but who have so long inhabited a world where decency and ownership are the same thing that they can no longer tell them apart. You would have lost the land, he said. Maybe, she said. That's a thing that might have happened. But what happened in fact is that I didn't lose it, and now I have an affidavit filed and a record that can't be moved, and I did the second part myself. She looked at him steadily. I'm grateful for what you did. I'm not grateful for what you tried to do with it afterward. Those are two different things, and I know the difference even if you don't. He looked at her for a long moment. He was 61 years old, and in that moment he looked at looked every year of it, looked like a man standing at the edge of understanding something that is too late to change. "I suppose I did," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at something past her shoulder, at the street or the ridge or whatever distance a man looks at when he is doing his accounting in front of someone else. "I suppose I did try to use it." She didn't say anything. "I wasn't trying to harm you," he said. "I know that," she said. "That's the hardest part of it to explain." He walked away then, back toward his store, his boots slow on the boards. She watched him go. She did not feel triumph, which she had half expected. She felt something more complex and less satisfying. The feeling of having been through something that didn't leave a clean wound, that left instead a long bruise that would take time to fade. She rode home in the January cold, the mule moving steady under her, the ridge cutting the pale sky the same way it always had. The 40 acres were quiet when she rode in. The goats bleated from the pen. The cottonwoods stood bare over Jessie's grave. Everything was exactly as she had left it, which was to say it was hers, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. She filed the affidavit the following week, witnessed by Pete Hennessy and a woman named Dorothea Cass who ran the hat shop and who Lina had chosen precisely because Dorothea was the kind of woman who remembered everything she witnessed and was not afraid to say so. The spring came, as springs do in that country, not gently but suddenly, the earth cracking open and the mesquite leafing out and the brown creek running a little faster than it had. Lina planted the garden and kept the animals and sold her eggs on Saturday mornings. She began expanding the south pasture in April, clearing the brush with a methodical patience that she could sustain for hours. She was thinking about cattle, a small herd to begin, nothing ambitious, just enough to give the land a second purpose. Harlan Bode kept his feed store on the main street. She went back to buying her grain there, because it was the closest and the cheapest and because she was not going to let what had happened between them cost her in practical terms. He served her with the same steady politeness he showed everyone, and she paid him exact, coins counted in her palm, and they said what needed to be said and no more. It was not comfortable, but comfort had never been the point. The Garfield brothers moved their fence line back to the creek that spring. She didn't know whether Emmett Cross had sent them something official, or whether they had simply run the math and found it didn't add up anymore. She watched the wire come down from a distance and she felt something move through her chest that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction but was somewhere between the two. The feeling of a thing that had been pressing against you finally withdrawing, leaving the bruise behind. Summer came again. The dust rose again. The valley sat fat and orange in the afternoon heat and people went about their business and Caldwell Creek continued being what it was. A small hard town on the edge of a large hard country, full of people trying to hold on to what they had and take what they could and survive the distance between the two. Lina was out in the south pasture on a morning in late June, running a new fence line, when a young woman on horseback rode up on the road and stopped. She was perhaps 18, wearing a dress that had been mended in 3 places, with the look of someone who had ridden a good distance. She leaned over her horse's neck and called out, "Are you the widow Marsh?" Lina set down her post-hole digger and walked to the fence line. "I am," she said. "I was told you might know something about land claims," the young woman said. She had a direct gaze that Lina recognized, the particular directness of someone who has had to learn to hold their own. "My husband filed on 40 acres north of the creek 2 years ago. He died last winter. There's a man who says the claim didn't transfer proper." Lina looked at her for a moment, at her mended dress and her straight back and her direct eyes. "Get down off that horse," she said. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The young woman climbed down. Her name was Ada Finch, and she had come from a property 12 miles up the valley, and her situation was almost exactly Lina's own from 2 years prior, which did not surprise Lina in the least. These were the shapes that things took in this country. The same shapes, the same pressures, the same instruments of erosion, working on different women in the same way. They sat at the kitchen table, Lina and Ada Finch, and Lina told her about Emmett Cross and Ruth Alcott's association and what the territorial statute said about surviving spouse claims, and she drew it out slowly and clearly the way Emmett had drawn it out for her, and she watched Ada's face change from the pale tight look of someone who has been told there is no way to do something to the different look, the one that comes when a person understands that the door is actually there, that it has been there all along, and that someone has just handed them the key. She wrote the letter for Ada that evening. She wrote Ruth Alcott's address from memory, because she had written it enough times now to know it. Because Ada was not the first woman who had come to her kitchen table with a mended dress and a direct gaze and a piece of paper that somebody was using to take away what was hers. She had been to 3 other kitchens in the valley since January, sitting across from women whose situations wore different details but the same fundamental shape, and she had written letters from each of those tables too, and she had heard back from 2 of them already that the outcomes had held. She had started keeping a ledger, not of money but of cases, dates, names, statute references, notes on what had worked and what hadn't. The flour tin under the flour was full now. She'd had to start a second tin. On the night that Ada Finch rode home with Ruth Alcott's address and a letter of introduction in her saddlebag, Lina sat on the porch in the dark for a while, listening to the creek run. It was a sound she had learned to love without meaning to, the slow brown sound of the creek at night, moving the way things moved in this country. Not dramatically but persistently, wearing at the stone year by year, making its way regardless. She thought about what Harlan had said on the street in January. "I saved your life." She thought about the word saved, about what it meant and what it assumed. That without him she would have been finished, that the hearing would have gone the other way, that she had been a passive vessel for his intervention. She did not know for certain that any of that was true. She did not know what Judge Alcott would have ruled without Harlan's testimony. Maybe differently, maybe the same. But she knew this, that whatever saving had happened in August of 1882, the destroying had started the same day. That the 2 had not been separate events but the same event, the front and back of the same hand. He had extended a kindness and immediately begun converting it into leverage, so quietly and so gradually that she doubted he had fully understood what he was doing, doubted he had sat down and planned it the way a man plans a trap. It had likely felt, from the inside, like concern, like generosity, like the reasonable expectations of a decent man who had done something for a woman who needed doing for. That was the part that would not resolve into anything simple, the part that kept her sitting on the porch after the stars had come out over the ridge. The most damage in this world was not done by people who intended damage. It was done by people who had convinced themselves that what they wanted and what was good for someone else were the same thing, and who never had cause to examine that conviction because no one had ever successfully told them otherwise. She was not destroyed. That was the other thing she held on those evenings. Whatever he had tried to make of her situation, she was not destroyed. The land was hers. The ledger was filling up. Ada Finch was riding home with a letter in her saddlebag. Something that had started as survival had become, without her quite intending it, something larger. A pattern of knowledge moving from one woman's kitchen table to the next, a small and unglamorous chain of information passing hand to hand through the valley, woman to woman, each one arriving with the same tight face and the same direct eyes and the same piece of paper being used against her. None of it would show up in the record that the town kept. That record, the one that lived in conversation and reputation and the stories men told in saloons, still had Harlan Bode in it as the man who had saved the widow Marsh. That story had not changed and likely would not. He was solid and decent and good, and he had given his testimony and the judge had ruled, and that was the story. The rest of it existed in flour tins and in the memories of women who had come to her table, and in the small steady changes that moved through those 40 acres, the expanding pasture, the new well that she was saving toward, the fence line that held at the creek where the law said it should. Some things leave no record that anyone else can read. That didn't mean they hadn't happened. That didn't mean they didn't matter. The creek ran on in the dark. The cottonwood made its sound over Jessie's grave, that particular dry whisper that was not quite like any other sound in the world. The goats were quiet in their pen. The land was hers. She sat on the porch until the cold came off the ridge, then went inside and put another log on the fire and opened the second flour tin and took out the ledger and made the entry for Ada Finch, name, date, property location, statute reference, notes on the particular circumstances. She wrote in a clear and careful hand, because someday she thought someone else might need to read this. Not Alcott, not Cross, not anyone with a title. Just a woman at a kitchen table with a mended dress and a piece of paper, trying to find the door. Lina Marsh would leave the door open. She always had. Outside, the dust settled in the dark of the valley, patient as it always was, waiting for morning to rise again. But inside the cabin the lamp burned clean and steady, and the hand that held the pen did not waver, and the writing on the page was plain and true and would still be readable long after the dust had covered everything else. That was the work. Not the loud work, not the testified work, not the work that got spoken about over poker tables with the knowing nods of men who understood things. The quiet work, the unglamorous and patient work of one woman holding what was hers, and then reaching back to help the next one hold what was hers, and the next and the next. Nobody would call it saving. Maybe that was why it lasted.